This is the Kremlin, citadel of Russian communism. Looking at Russia, we might see it as a country to be studied, as we study other nations of the world. Yet we know that Russia today is regarded as a grave threat to our nation, to our freedom, to the peace of the world.
Following the end of World War II, America was relishing in an age of newfound nationalism. In an attempt to expand beyond the previous boundaries of international policy, presidents began to exert control over the United States' foreign neighbors. Opposing them was the Soviet Union, who became the spearhead of communism, influencing many Eastern and European nations to detract from the American ideal of capitalism. In retaliation, America began to take action, attempting to restore countries to a pseudo-independence that largely benefited the US. However, tensions reached a breaking point, and Russia and the US entered the Cold War, utilizing their nuclear weapons to threaten each other into a begrudging impasse. As a result, instead of using military force to determine the winner, scientific progress became the main weapon of the war, as both sides competed to see who could achieve more scientific breakthroughs. Born from this rivalry was MKUltra, a multinational series of clandestine, CIA-funded experiments during the latter half of the Cold War, created due to the apparent failure of diplomacy between the United States and the Soviet Union. Its purpose was to confirm the plausibility of human mind control and to aid the Americans in their so-called battle for the mind against the Soviet Union. However, despite the project's nationalistic motivations, its unethical operations were later revealed in government investigations, which resulted in public debate that expanded even beyond American borders, ultimately generating government reforms and leading to unintended consequences that uprooted the way that the American public interacted with its government.
While experimentation in MKUltra had already been in progress years before it was radicalized, it was Sidney Gottlieb's leadership that changed the course of the experiments. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist by trade, had the scientific knowledge necessary to lead the project and also demonstrated his capabilities as a leader by climbing the governmental hierarchy at an unprecedented rate. With his support, the researchers of MKUltra began to investigate a new drug of interest, lysergic acid diethylamide, also known as LSD, which caused many symptoms among research subjects, including but not limited to visual hallucinations and psychosis.
LSD was isolated by Stoll and Hoffman in a Sandoz pharmaceutical company of Basel, Switzerland. When in 1943 Hoffman became temporarily psychotic through accidental ingestion of the drug, the door swung wide open for research into the nature of the schizophrenic process and in a larger sense into the biochemistry of psychoses. TV's Paul Coates of Confidential File undertook to film a model psychosis in our laboratory in an attempt to impress upon the public, through a case of artificial insanity, that the mentally ill is not inhabited by the devil.
In documents released under the newly introduced FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act, it was revealed that these scientists and researchers were being allowed to operate on unwitting and unwilling subjects, more specifically American college students and mental health patients who had no idea such experimentation was going on. Yet this method of experimentation was preferred because it would allow for scientists and researchers to achieve the most accurate of results due to the obliviousness of the patients. For example, across the US-Canadian border in Montreal, MKUltra experimentation continued on psychiatric patients under Donald Ewan Cameron, where victims suffered after entering the Allen Memorial Institute seeking treatment. These treatments, also called the Montreal experiments, not only undermined the trust that Americans had for their government, but also impacted the way Canadians viewed their own. Researchers would inject patients with LSD, which they believed would be able to break the mind and aid in the process of completely controlling a person's psyche.
Dr. Cramer's techniques included an austere mind control procedure designed to subordinate a patient's free will in order to establish mind control through mental depatterning.
Phyllis Goldberg, a patient seeking help from the Allen Memorial Institute, was in search of treatment for her mild depression. Due to the treatment she received there, she was later described as an infant by Marlene Levinson, a niece of Phyllis and one of her closest surviving relatives.
She could not live a normal life. She could not get married. She could not have children. She was deprived of all those things.
Permanent scars were left on the psyche of Phyllis, and only later did her family realize why.
And every time I put my hand on her head, she would cringe. And I didn't understand until I realized because of the electric shock treatment that was put on their heads, and for the deprivation, sensory deprivation, that she had to wear all these headphones.
At first, such tales may appear to be isolated to an extent, with few being subjected to the tortures that MKUltra entailed. But the true terror is that over 80 institutions across the US and even more in other countries have participated in these experiments, the full extent of which has never been revealed to the public. It greatly contributed to decades of debate on the legitimacy of powers held by American bureaucratic agencies under the pretext of national security.
When the Watergate scandal under the Nixon administration publicly exploded into a government affair, the CIA became closely scrutinized for their involvement in the scandal. As a result, all documentation on the project was ordered to be destroyed by Richard Helms, the director of the CIA at the time, in an attempt to hide the proceedings of MKUltra from governmental investigation committees. It was only then, when the New York Times published an exposé which alleged that the secretive CIA investigations and experimentations were being done on US citizens, that the government responded by launching a full investigation onto the intelligence agencies. Created by President Gerald Ford, the Rockefeller Commission was called into order, led by Nelson Rockefeller, Vice President of the United States at the time. The commission investigated the CIA in a way it had never done before and discovered the highly illegal experimentation under MKUltra, compiling a report that was later published, calling into question the CIA's authority and recommending adjustments to be made to clarify what the CIA had jurisdiction over. The report led to the 1975 Senate hearings on intelligence and caused restrictions to be placed on the CIA. A new committee called the Intelligence Oversight Board was established by President Ford by Executive Order 11905 in order to periodically review and report to the government any findings that may raise questions of legality or propriety.
History is often forgotten, not solely because of time itself, but because it is easier to imagine a glorious future rather than embrace the tragedies and terrors that plague the past. The lives of so many victims were ruined.
Whose siblings or whose parents were subject to massive electroshock treatments and the experimental drugs and the psychic driving inflicted upon them by the late Dr. in which treatments were funded by the Government of Canada and the CIA.
The punishment ultimately amounted to nothing more than a slap on the wrist for an agency as large and extensive as the CIA. While MKUltra has all but faded within public consciousness, its impact continues to live on through LSD. By bringing the drug into America, the CIA had incidentally created a new set of problems. The drugs, which had been taken from the CIA, rose in popularity in the United States and led to drug parties through which the majority of the public became exposed to LSD. The popular usage of the drug was at an all-time high during the counterculture movement of the 1960s and contributed to the movement as a whole, but it had certainly not been the intention of the CIA to popularize the recreational usage of the drug, unlike their willingness to use it on unconsenting citizens. MKUltra's original purpose was to oppose the Soviet Union in order to boost the national prestige of America and by extension capitalism through science and technological advancements. However, somewhere in the process of experimentation, the project lost its way, resorting to clearly unethical means to grasp at an unreachable goal. Not only did the project fail to produce results that could be considered satisfactory, it ended up unintentionally causing the American populace more harm than even the Russians did with their own experimentation.
I'm going to give you this cup that contains lysergic acid 100 microgram. Will you drink it? How did it taste?
It had no taste.
How did it look?
Colorless.
Now, would you tell me your name, please?
William Millark.
And what is your address?
3540 The Paseo, Los Angeles, 65.